Um, I would like to introduce the panel for Reimagining Blackness, Reimagining Art, Literature, and History Through Blackness. My name is David Ponton III, and I have the somewhat awkward opportunity to introduce myself as a member of the panel. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies on the Tampa campus. Earned my BA in Religious Studies, Social Studies Education, and African American Studies at Princeton, and my Master's and PhD in History from Rice University. Dr. Tangela Serls, who's going to be speaking for us first today, is an Associate Professor of Instruction in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies on the Tampa campus, and she is also recently appointed as the Special Advisor on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion to the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Serls earned her BA in English at Fort Valley State University, and if I can brag on her for a second, she graduated valedictorian. Tangela earned her master's in education at FAMU and her PhD in English and Literary Studies at USF. McAuthur Freeman, who will be speaking with us last today, earned his Bachelor of Fine Art at the University of Florida, his Master of Fine Art degree at Cornell University, and his Master of Art in Design, Animation, New Media, and Digital Imaging at North Carolina State University. Together, the three of us comprise the first cohort of the USF Humanities Institute Faculty Fellows Program last year with our proposed theme of Reimagining Blackness. Our work together has helped find and till fertile ground for ideas about Blackness across seemingly different disciplines, historian, literary scholar, and an artist, and through seemingly disparate schools of thought, including Black optimism, Afro-pessimism, and Afrofuturism. Though we remain embedded in a collective project of reimagining Blackness, we also have learned through this process that a critical encounter with Blackness requires a reimagining of the very disciplines in which we labor and how they can be reinvented to facilitate resistance, healing, and dreaming. So, Dr. Serls, I will give the podium to you.
Oh, maybe not. Oh, it should be fine. Good morning, everyone. Can y'all hear me? All right, perfect. Thank you to the Institute on Black Life for the opportunity to be here with you all today. The title of my talk is Reimagining Blackness, Healing Racial Injustice Through Literary Arts, and more specifically, poetry. So for me, one of the horrors of living in this present moment is figuring out how to navigate the psychological terror that comes with being a Black person in the United States. It is imperative that we create and sustain more inclusive, welcoming spaces, but it would be disingenuous of me to not give voice to how difficult and laborious the work can be. In my work, I honor the insights of Black feminist scholars such as Catherine McKittrick, who teaches us that Black matters are deeply connected to our physical environment and the spaces we inhabit, and Saidiya Hartman, who reminds us of the power of storytelling and the importance of understanding the past in order to create a better future. Hartman teaches us that we must look critically at the ways in which our histories are written and presented to us, and that our personal narratives can be a powerful tool in creating change. Her work has been invaluable in bringing attention to the issues of racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression, and her method, critical fabulation, which operates within the registers of past, present, and future, expresses a sensibility that honors the legacy of our ancestors while recognizing that we are connected to them through the imagination. Among other characteristics, critical fabulation operates within the subjunctive, which is a mood that expresses sensibilities, possibilities, doubts, and wishes. Critical fabulation, operating within the subjunctive, implores us to think of the living and the dead as interdependent. This is the prevailing mood for the original poems that I'll share with you all later in my talk. It is true that living as a Black person in the United States can be incredibly difficult and challenging. Personally, I found that it is a struggle to unhinge my imagination from the shackles of colonialism. Navigating the quotidian instances of racialized discrimination requires strength, courage, and resilience, which I don't always have. I found the best way for me to attempt this undertaking is to remain in community and find ways to cultivate moments of joy. And I'd just like to go off record real quick, or off script rather, and just thank my collaborators and interlocutors, because without David McAuthur, I wouldn't have the space or community to think deeply about these issues that we're going to be talking to you all about today. So, in doing so, I find moments of inspiration in the midst of struggle. Over the past year and a half, I have reignited my love and appreciation of poetry and have come to realize that the good Lord, that is Audre Lorde, was right. Poetry is not a luxury, and this is a direct quote from her. Poetry is not a luxury. For living within living structures defined by profit, by linear power, by institutional dehumanization, our feelings were not meant to survive. Kept around as unavoidable adjuncts or pleasant pastimes, feelings were expected to kneel to thought as women were expected to kneel to men. But women have survived as poets, and there are no new pains. We've fed them all already. We have hidden the fact in the same place where we have hidden our power. These places of possibility within ourselves are dark because they are ancient and hidden. They have survived and grown strong through that darkness. Within these deep places, each one of us holds an incredible reserve of creativity and power, of unexamined and unrecorded emotion and feeling. They surface in our dreams, and it is our dreams that point the way to freedom. Those dreams are made realizable through our poems that gives us strength and courage to see, to feel, to speak, and to dare. If what we need to dream to move our spirits most deeply and directly toward and through promise is discounted as luxury, then we give up the core, the fountain of our power, the future of our worlds. End quote. And with that, I'd like to share a few original poems with you all that have helped me move towards healing as I navigate my contemporary existence, living and working in a state where Black people's humanity is being denied and undermined, a state where we live in psychological terror. Shame. Indeed. Poetry in general, and these poems specifically, have served as a sanctuary as I journey forward. And so my first set of poems are Aintu poems. The Aintu is a form of African American poetry that consists of 7 lines with a total of 32 syllables or words. The lines have a 2-4-6-8 6-4-2 structure, which indicates the cyclical nature of life. The last poem I'll share is a litany, which is a poetic form that can be described as a prayer or supplication and is often used in formal and religious processions. And so I'll also give a little bit of background to these poems. So the Aintus I created during our fellowship with the Humanities Institute, I think fall 21. And the second one in particular is the one that served as kind of like the seedling for the litany that'll come at the end. And so Aintu 1 reads, I want freedom to rise with the moon and set with the sun. I want liberty with them, but it evades me. Rejoice in the struggle. The second Aintu is, I want to run away to worlds inside myself. I promise to come back for you. Freedom and liberty, we struggle to take them. And the third one, I am whole, healed, and filled with grace, spirit, and pride. Gratitude and devotion to dark and the light. Shema, ever ready, Amen. Amen. And so, thank y'all. Real quick, that the second one really touches like a place deep within me, especially with the line about run away to worlds inside myself. I was thinking specifically of the fact that when a person is pregnant, if they're pregnant with a female uterus, that female uterus or female has all the eggs that they'll ever have in their life. So essentially, when my grandmother was pregnant with my mother, I was there too. And so I just think about what my grandmother had to be going through when she was pregnant with my mom in the 60s and how that kind of continues this cycle. And so kind of trying to get in touch with those worlds that they inhabited. Okay, so next I'll read my litany. And so this one is kind of like me going into the world, so to speak. I knew that I would be starting a new position and I would be away from the classroom for a short bit. And so I wanted to leave my students with some sort of inspiration or hope. And so the title of this one is A Litany for My Students
For one through their survival. And this was written in inspiration from Audre Lorde's Litany for Survival. I have returned to show you the way to life, the way to survive. Be careful what you meditate on. Blackness, grief, the light are all acceptable. When fear grips like grief, do not be afraid. Be brave, unbossed, unbought. When fear encloses upon your throat, use their tongues to make a liar out of them. When breathing is burdensome, when survival is struggle, plant seeds of hope and reap the harvest of my fidelity. And with that, I will turn it over to the next presenter for your Todd and something.
Thank you, Tangela. Tangela always has the job of drawing you in, and I have the job of depressing you. And then McAuthur has the job of lifting you back up. So this is Healing the Archival Bloom. I focus a lot of my research attention to the mid-20th century because I'm fascinated by the word desegregation. I'm also fascinated by the city of Houston, a place that boosters and historians have often described as a unique urban center in the South. A place that managed to desegregate without a major race riot with only one fatality. A police officer shot and killed by his own colleagues during an attack on Texas Southern University in 1967. As a person who grew up in a majority Black and Latinx community in a majority low-income city surrounded by affluent and white suburbs, on all sides, I had an intuitive sense that desegregation was a misnomer. And as a researcher, I quickly learned that historians significantly circumscribe the definitions of violence and death when they identify only those canonically major events, Bloody Sunday in Selma or the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham, as the image of American racism. These stories are important, but I'm also intrigued and troubled by the ways they have been folded into America's narrative of racial progress. More than that, I'm disturbed by the ways the spectacular nature of these events have come to define the limit of white America's terror against Black people, when the depravity is also so much more quotidian and mundane. This was not the original talk I was going to give, but as I reflected on the murder of Tyree Nichols this weekend, I thought it was important to consider the erasure of the normal of Black existence during moments that are treated as exceptional. Research has shown that regardless of our personal connection or even geographic proximity to an instance of fatal police violence against an unarmed Black person, we Black people suffer significant and chronic poor mental health for days, weeks, and sometimes months after our initial exposure. That same research shows that other groups do not share in that trauma. The fact that we can scarcely go a few days without hearing some similar story, even if it doesn't result in death, suggests we endure perpetual attacks on our mental health that are not even registered by public health officials or government leaders as a crisis.
In fact, this weekend, Ohio Representative Jim Jordan admitted the beating of Nichols demonstrated a, quote, lack of respect for human life, but concluded that he doesn't know that there's any law that can stop the evil that we saw. Meanwhile, to address violent crime, which remains at some of the lowest rates we've seen in decades, leaders like Jim Jordan support Joe Biden's plan to spend $13 billion to hire 100,000 new police officers over the next 5 years. Apparently, no cost is too great to fund the very machine that will, with all certainty, according to Jim Jordan himself, continue to steal Black lives. Today, though, I would like to say something very simple with my limited time about the role of historians in telling Black stories. As I recently argued in this article in History and Theory, an Afro-pessimist account of history, the historical discipline and profession have an anti-Black problem. Historians pursue the art of narrative. We tell stories with beginnings, climaxes, and endings, and oftentimes when we do so, we gesture toward a future that was brighter than the bleak past that we're compelled to write about. These local gestures accomplish little other than to comfort the reader and the writer, and lighten the weight of the depravity that is anti-Blackness, in some ways folding Black people's suffering into a narrative of progress, or at least a narrative of boundless hope and Western liberalism's promises as a consequence of the historian's training and approach to the archive. Although most historians admit that positivism is passé, we still often treat the archive as the only repository of fact and truth, the only location from which we can derive truths. And if a truth is not in the archive, we are trained to understand it is beyond our disciplinary capacity to broach. But it is precisely the unspoken, the undocumented, the erased experiences of Black people that need to be broached, and that expose the still quite positivist approach to writing that most historians survive by. For instance, in the archive, I encountered the story of Billy Bodenheimer, a 12-year-old white boy who was raped and murdered in Houston's well-to-do Montrose neighborhood in 1959. The Houston Police Department arrested 7 Black teenagers and young adults for the crime, residents of the Green Pond area. And as you can see on this map, you have your proportion of residents by race, obviously a very segregated city. You have Montrose, which is majority or completely white at this point, and then Green Pond up in here, a small neighborhood that is Black. This Reconstruction era Black neighborhood was surrounded by new developments created by white developers who understood that wealthy white residents would want to live near low-wage earning Black domestics. Despite having clear and numerous alibis that the young men were involved in a neighborhood boxing match during the time of Bodenheimer's abduction, despite Billy's own mother making a public letter stating that she believed the young Black men were innocent, and despite that there had been a string of attempted abductions of white children in that neighborhood by an unidentified white man for weeks prior to this, all the Black boys and young men were found guilty of his assault and murder. The young men claimed that police had forced them to make false confessions. Indeed, police placed the boys in the icebox where Bodenheimer's body had been found, as they, quote, wanted these niggers to see the ghost of that white boy. Meanwhile, some white Houstonians issued public threats, swearing to, quote, bludgeon any Black people who crossed their paths with a baseball bat, and they demanded more segregation, stricter laws, and greater punishments against Black Houstonians. As a result, 17-year-old Adrian Johnson was convicted of murder. His appeals were denied, and he was executed by electrocution after his final words, I want to pray. I pray that this will be the last time something like this will happen. This is a profound moment for me as a historian in the archive because it is really the only real thing we know about Adrian Johnson. He was an ordinary Black teenager in a working class neighborhood. There's nothing remarkable about him in the archive except this encounter with the state and its violence. And if I were wedded to positivism, this is all I would dare to say about him. But history is an art form. Michelle Roth-Trio encourages us to think about how history gets produced. And Saidiya Hartman, whom Tangela spoke about, gives us models for how to treat history as a literary practice. How to use the subjunctive mood, for example, to narrate the impossibility of telling the story. So when I think about how we can reimagine a historical discipline through Blackness, I think about healing the wounds we incur by a regular erasure from the archive. It is not as if we encounter real people in the archive anyway. We always already encounter representations of people. So as I write, I'm constructing a representation of someone called Adrian Johnson, but in doing so, I'm also writing myself into the story. You're never reading just what a historian found. You're reading through the historian. So you're looking through my mind's eye at a person who both existed in this world in some capacity, and also someone who only exists as a representation. And this allows us to do what idea of art can act, that's the critical evaluation. So I ask questions to narrate the impossibility of narration. Beyond his encounter with the state, was Adrian Johnson an aspiring boxer who hoped to one day be a worldwide sensation? Or was he bookish and an avid burner? Perhaps he was an unexceptional student, seeing the poor opportunities available for Black high school graduates in Houston in 1959. Was he already working odd jobs with a relative or a mentor who showed him alternative paths to economic security? What kind of trouble did he get into? How often did he drink, smoke cannabis, or skip school? Perhaps he played a musical instrument like TSU students, or loved working with his hands. But he visited his grandparents daily like so many young Black Houstonians do. Perhaps he was gay, bisexual, or something indeterminate given his known involvement with an older man. Did he have a boyfriend, girlfriend? Did he ever experience puppy love or heartbreak? What did love look like to him? What did love feel like to him? Who was the last person he embraced or the first eyes he stared into with longing? What in the end can we feel emanating from a person who, as all the evidence shows, was innocent of the crime for which he was charged, stared death in the face, and who seemed to see at the side's eye a future of Black boys and men who would suffer a similar fate? And in all of that, he turned to his God and prayed for the world to hear this would never happen again. In the end, these questions are unanswerable, but they are not unutterable. The gap in the lives of the archive do not make it impossible to speak. Adrian Johnson spoke a prayer, and so must historians speak, even under disciplinary duress. One of my hopes in deploying this idea of Hartman's critical fabulation is not to fill the gap. Historians cannot fill the gap caused by the archival wound. But we can use the gap to remind us of the significance of Black lives, the beauty in the ordinary, the moral fortitude embedded in us, the clarity with which we see the world and its machinations, despite how much that self-same world denies our capacity to critique and to see, the vulnerability with which we produce social life even as we abide social death. Adrian Johnson's murder by the state was not a pit stop on the journey toward or an aberration distracting from the American province. He was loved, he gave love, he hurt, and perhaps he hurt others. He laughed and cried, he smiled, he dreamed and despaired, he inspired, and his life was stolen. And I say these things despite that they are not archived. I say these things not to burden us with bad feelings. Rather, I say them because Adrian Johnson mattered. He was here and his loss meant something. In order for historians to participate in the practice of healing, we must mourn in and for the ordinary. How beautiful and terrifying it is to think of Adrian Johnson as a kid who prayed nothing like this would ever happen again, in a city where it would happen again, and in a historiographical tradition where his name and names like his would be badged to promote a story of peaceful desegregation that defies his life and death. In other words, to heal the archival wound, we must undiscipline ourselves and reinvent history through the arts. And then I will just say rest in peace to Tyree Nichols. Whoa.
So my name is McAuthur Freeman, and I'm a visual artist. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about working with David and Tangela is having the conversations and being able to have the time to concentrate on that part of it, maybe beyond just making the edges. I'll talk a little bit about, let's see if I can. I'm going to talk about Reimagining Blackness. I'll start here. On Monday, I told my son that he needs to be quiet. He needs to be aware of his surroundings, that he needs to be careful who he's hanging out with. That sometimes it doesn't matter if he's not doing something wrong. He can be lumped in with the drama that is nearby. That sometimes resisting and even explaining that he hasn't done anything wrong at the wrong moment can get him killed. He's 11 years old. He loves Legos and superheroes. And while on one hand, this is a conversation that I don't want to have with him at this age, I have to think about what could happen if I don't. It was the day after seeing Tyree Nichols on video and watching the related news reports, which is something I would never let him see, but he has heard me talking about. I just masked parts of the events and sometimes talked them for my own. On social media, I also saw repeated warnings not to watch. These were messages for us to protect our mental health, as the repetition of Black pain can often be held up as spectacle. But with something like this, I want to know the truth. I must see for myself. I don't want to forget the reality. As well, I don't want the past hidden from me. In the mornings I drive my son to school, we like to listen to podcasts on the way, and they're usually about science. And I love that he's so interested. Some of them are really for adults, but it's educational and it has humor, which you might. I like the podcast because a slow teacher piece of kept to new topics. And by ourselves, while driving to school, we have conversations that he couldn't have at any other time. And true, I was productive in the morning. I get up early, I have tons of deadlines and plenty of work to do. And work-wise, it would probably be better for you to send him to his lunch class or car. However, I know the time passes by quickly. And if I can build that daily activity or build that into a daily activity, it adds up. One day something may be too cool for me. So I better get as much time as I can now. And making it a daily routine like that with no other options, make sure that it happens. Sometimes the science podcasts don't come out fast enough. So we just started listening to The Day, a podcast from the New York Times that tackles one major issue in the news for the day and then gives snippets of other things going on in the world. The week before, he learned about aggressive approaches to childhood obesity, the current protests in Iran and the war in Ukraine. He said he was interested and he would pause at parts to talk about it. Or we would talk, and just to explain ideas sometimes or things that he didn't understand. But on this morning, as we left the house, he knew not to bother me while I got acclimated to the road. He sat patiently, hoping that I would play something on the way in. He sat patiently as I pressed the button for the podcast app. There was no new science episode. It was the new daily, with one line for the title, The Death of Tyree Nichols. It sat at the top of my playlist as the topic for the day, and no other current podcasts were available. I sat there driving with just silence. He knew something about it, but he didn't ask any more questions. I looked over at him, and I said, I need you to comply. Don't say anything smart, and no back talking, seeing fight, resisting, unless you have to run, unless you have to fight. You gotta read the cards, decide your best options. But more than anything, you've got to be aware. It was a barrage of somewhat disorganized comments, but in my mind, I kept going because I didn't say out loud. You can't get angry. You can't buy a bag of Skittles. You can't wear a hoodie. You can't sit on your front porch. You can't reach for your ID. You can't go for a jog. You can't get ice cream in your own house. You can't breathe. But we have to breathe. It feels as if there is no safe place and there is no peace. For what if? What if I could encourage him to be audacious, to not tone down his behavior, that resistance is critical, to fully be himself? What if I didn't have to impart a bit of fear? What if protecting himself didn't mean that he had to shrink in some cases and perform hypermasculinity in others? What if I didn't have to extinguish his fire just a little bit? What if I could enjoy and encourage his joy, fearlessness, and Black aliveness? As an artist, I make works about race, identity, and socialization. Over my career, I've used fantasy to talk about real events, and those images have been strange and absurd because the contradictions of living the American dream and the dystopian reality of how Blackness has been positioned in that dream is frequently surreal and horrific. As part of the Humanities Institute Fellowship, I was able to work with Dr. Serls and Dr. Ponton while discussing a broad range of topics related to Blackness and storytelling. These included Afro-pessimism, Afro-futurism, Black love, Black horror, and many others. While there are many outcomes of those discussions, a few things became clear to me. We need to tell our own stories. We need to share those stories with ourselves, because our perspectives, which have often been marginalized, excluded, or erased, are important. We spend a lot of time justifying our existence, making an argument for our value, explaining our pain, fighting for what is left of what was already ours. And those things are important because it is important to fight for the right causes, but it is also important to live and to find and both create places to just be. The constant need to hold the line while not being seen is a burden that adds up. It causes us to sacrifice our own mental and physical health to go along. While we're not receiving the support that we need for Black and brown people, taking care of yourself and your own well-being can also be an anti-racist act. I'm also going to show a few images. But I'm not going to talk a lot about them because I think what is more important right now is the reason for them. My wife, Elizabeth Horch Freeman, and I started making images together. We used AI software after seeing the potential of the technology, and there were at least 8 or 9 threads from our research, previous projects, and interests that brought us to investing our time in this project, which we called Reimagining Blackness. Coming out of the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and the shock of the COVID pandemic, it was an escape. It allowed us to collaborate, and it allows us to address a lack of Black representation. We wanted to make beautiful images of Black people that we often don't get to see in other places. We wanted to explore fantasy to create stories and imagine a world where Blackness is not marginalized. And we recently opened an exhibition of those works some time ago at the History of the Enough Gallery. One part of the show is called Postcards from the Future. It features a series of 75 postcards from the year 2137 that features Black people at a futuristic oasis-like beach. On the wall near the postcards is a statement in vinyl letters that says, "Dear fam, we are waiting for our postcards. We want to know that you have arrived." The statement is something like a love letter to the future, waiting to know that Black people have found a space to thrive. The actual postcards in the show, or the actual postcards show that they have reached their destination and that they are, and we are, all right. They represent our ability to dream and visualize something different, and we invite others to imagine as well, to collectively dream, write the vision, and make it plain. What can happen when we all have a vision that we want to happen in 1 or 2 years? 10 years? Can we imagine that far? And does that help us put into perspective how small the other day-to-day drama, details, and emails really are? Can just envisioning that alternate future and far-out vision change how we navigate now? My previous works were more explicit critiques that highlight the issues and problems of systemic anti-Blackness. These works, these new works, focus on Black utopias and are an implicit critique. Their primary goal is one of curiosity, love, unity, and affirmation. However, the idea that we need to travel across the galaxy, create worlds at the bottom of the ocean, or go far into the future to escape anti-Blackness shows the challenging condition of our current reality. It's amazing what you can do when you take action on something that you have imagined when you haven't gotten the memo that it's out of your reach, versus the limits that we put on ourselves when we're told that we can't do better. There's so much going on that it seems we can only be reactive. We can only think about constraints that we have to work within. But this idea of Imagine Blackness is a call to take a breath and visualize what could be, beyond what people are telling you is possible and beyond the noun, beyond the time constraints, beyond the political climate and financial constraints. Now's the time to reimagine. It doesn't just have to be fairy tales, gardens, and beaches. What happens when we reimagine education, reimagine our finances, reimagine healthcare and self-care, reimagine our conversations, our careers, reimagine our work-life balance, and reimagine our time? Dreaming sometimes gets undervalued because there's so much emphasis on taking proper immediate action. But engaging our imagination to think beyond the now is an action. It is important to imagine where we want to be, what we want to do, and what we want to happen. That thought experiment is valuable, and the outcome of it can be beyond our reactionary moment-to-moment actions. Allowing ourselves to freely imagine can do several things. It can reflect our desires, it can be fun, it can be creative, it can be speculative, it can be affirming. It allows us to reflect, but it can also be responsive to the issues of the current times and conditions. It allows us to brainstorm. It gives us ideals to pursue and alternatives to the current conditions. And with those visions in mind, we may be able to see our way out, plan our way out, problem solve, imagine something beyond what the current limits allow. So to move forward, we must allow ourselves to dream. When being woke is under attack, we will dream more powerfully, imagine more powerfully, and we will do both because those things are interconnected. Thank you.
So that is the end of our panel. We're at about time, but we wanted to just give our thanks to Tangela for backing us at the College of Arts and Sciences for all of the support she's given us, and of course, Dr. Denise Toppin. And we will be here throughout the conference, so we're happy to chat with people and answer questions and ask questions. Thank you so much for your time. Morning.